Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to take part in today's webinar on OSHA's new Silica standard and what contractors need to know. Just a little bit of background on our topic today. Crystalline silica is a common mineral that is found in a variety of construction materials such as sand, stone, concrete, brick, and mortar. And when workers cut, grind, drill, or crush materials that contain crystalline silica, very small dust particles are created. These tiny particles, also known as respirable particles, can travel deep into workers' lungs. Overexposure to these particles over time can cause silicosis, which is an incurable and sometimes deadly lung disease. Now, to better protect workers exposed to respirable crystalline silica, OSHA issued two new respirable crystalline silica standards, one for construction and the other for general industry and maritime. As you may or may not know, OSHA is already enforcing most provisions of the standard for construction as of September 23rd, 2017, and will begin enforcing most provision of the standard for general industry and maritime on June 23rd, 2018. Over the next hour or so, we will be presenting slides to help you follow along with the general conversation. We encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we will answer those at the end during the Q&A period. In order to submit a question, you can just type them into the control panel under the chat tab on the right side of your screen and then hit enter. But before we begin, I would like to give everyone a quick overview of Society Insurance. We are a regional insurance carrier based in beautiful Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. We currently write business in 5 states: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Tennessee. Our specialty is providing insurance for select business niches, focusing on the small details that make the biggest difference. We have been writing workers' compensation coverage since our beginning in 1915, but we also offer property, liability, and commercial auto coverage with extensive knowledge and experience in protecting restaurants, bars, supermarkets, convenience stores, hotels and motels, medical clinics, and artisan contractors. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Pat O'Brien, and I'm a Senior Risk Control Representative with Society Insurance. I've been with Society for just over 13 years now, working with a variety of accounts, including contractors ranging from small to large. Also with us today is Kay Roundtree from Industrial Hygiene Sciences. She is a certified industrial hygienist with 30+ years of experience providing industrial consultation services to small, medium, and large employers. Today we will be focusing our presentation on 3 main learning objectives. What is the hazard? How might non-compliance impact the business? And what is the standard? If all goes well, by the end of this webinar, you should be able to answer these questions. What does OSHA's new silica standard require? What is Table 1? What makes a competent person? What goes into an exposure assessment? And how can I develop an exposure control plan? With that, I am going to turn it over to Kay.
Good morning. Before we start talking about the standard itself, I want to talk a little bit about some terms that you need to know as we go through the OSHA standards. The first is that they establish a permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter as a time-weighted average. And as a point of reference, in construction, this is a dramatic drop in the allowable level of silica that employees can be exposed to. The new standard also establishes an action level of 25 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, both of these levels are set up as time-weighted averages, which means that the number at the end of an 8-hour time period, the exposure at the end of an 8-hour time period cannot exceed the permissible exposure limit. You may have times during a shift when you have a higher dust exposure, but if that's averaged out over times when there's no exposure, your time-weighted average may still be under the permissible exposure limit. Today we'll be talking, the standards apply to only crystalline, respirable crystalline silica. And this is really important because there are other forms of silica that in the environment. The crystalline structure, there's 3 different ones. There's quartz, cristobalite, and tritonite. and it only applies to particles that are of respirable size, and we'll talk about what that is in a few minutes. Respirable dust is commonly applies to particles that are less than 10 microns in size. And that may not mean very much, but these are really small particles that may not even be visible to the naked eye. But if you shine a light beam through clouds of dust of respirable particle size, you will see them in the air. They're the very, very fine particles that are emitted. Larger particles just can't get deep into the lung, and so we don't really care about those as much. These particles, because they're so small, tend to drift around very easily. They follow the air currents, they float, they drop, they drift back up again when they're disturbed. And because they can readily move to areas beyond where they're generated, they can create exposures for what are called bystander employees, so that there may be exposure to a person doing a particular construction task, but that dust can also move and affect other people that might be in the room. So for example, if you have someone in a room that is grinding on concrete, but you have electricians or carpenters or other people in the area that aren't doing activities that generate dust, they still may be exposed to respirable particles because of the work of other employees. An important thing to remember is that when these particles become airborne, they can stay in the air for a very, very long period of time. So moving air out of rooms will take those particles with it, but if there is no ventilation or ways to remove these particles, the exposure times can be very long. So why did OSHA issue this standard in the first place? Well, they were concerned that about a disease called silicosis, which is a potentially disabling lung disease that does not have any cure. Silicosis occurs when these respirable particles get deep into the lung and create scar tissue. And once that scar tissue forms, the lung cannot readily move. And that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's what's happening. The lung becomes stiff, and people develop symptoms such as shortness of breath, coughing. Some cases are very severe. Other people have silicosis without the presence of actual symptoms. So the prognosis and the development of the disease is highly variable. But one thing is clear, that the more exposure there is to respirable crystalline silica dust, the greater the potential that someone will have more severe cases of silicosis. Respirable crystalline silica exposure is also associated with some other health conditions, including lung cancer, renal, which is kidney, and autoimmune disorders. These are things that OSHA feels are linked to exposure to respirable crystalline silica dust. OSHA felt that the existing limit for respirable crystalline silica was not adequately protective, and as I mentioned before, especially in the construction industry, the new PEL is much, much lower than the old one. So they felt that by establishing the new limit and the other attributes of the standard, that this would be more protective for workers. So where can you find silica? Well, there's a couple things to note, that there are not these non-crystalline forms of silica, and we'll talk about those in a second. These are on the right-hand side of the slide. But over on the left-hand side of the slide are terms that are used on safety data sheets or perhaps on labels that you might see on bags of materials that indicate that the product contains crystalline silica. So if you see a safety data sheet that has the word quartz on it, or silicon dioxide, or SiO2, these are all terms that are synonymous with crystalline silica, and these are the ones that you should be concerned about. Cristobalite, as I mentioned before, is another form of crystalline silica. However, in a construction environment, it's not very common to find cristobalite. Triple I and tritamite are also forms of crystalline silica, but they are very, very rare and unlikely to be found in a construction work site. So looking in the center of this slide, you can see the different products that contain crystalline silica. Some products, such as sand, can contain very high concentrations of crystalline silica, anywhere from 90 to 100%. Clays are commonly used in a lot of construction materials, but the amount of silica that's in those is highly variable, ranging from less than 1% up to 10 to 20 to 30%. For most contractors, concrete is one of the biggest exposures to crystalline silica when it's either made or it is disturbed. And silica content in concrete can range from anywhere from 25 to 75%. So concrete itself or anything made of concrete products, such as concrete spans, roads, that type of material, all contain crystalline silica. And when that is released in the form of dust, you create employee exposures. Mortars vary tremendously in the amount of crystalline silica that's there, as do grouts. And anywhere from 25 to 75% of those materials can contain crystalline silica. And as you go down through the list, you can see different percentages. Another big source of crystalline silica in products are in aggregate materials that may be used in road construction or to form concrete, granite, which may be used for decorative purposes in construction, engineered quartz, which can contain over 90% crystalline silica, which are used in countertops and other fabrications that might be used as facades in construction environments, and to a lesser extent limestone. A lot of limestone contains trace amounts of crystalline silica, with the amount varying depending on where that material was mined. Brick materials, tiles, ceramics, stucco, terrazzo, and refractories also can contain crystalline silica, and when these materials are cut or sanded or ground, you can release crystalline silica dust. Joint compounds, which are used in drywalling, can contain small amounts of crystalline silica. What I've seen over the years is that the percent of silica in these joint compounds has really reduced, and I think many of want to control, if you're looking at joint compounds, is to look for the lowest possible crystalline silica containing products if you're using those materials. For people who are involved in maybe driveway work or road construction, asphalt also contains crystalline silica, and materials that are made out of asphalt, such as asphalt shingles and other construction materials, also can contain crystalline silica. Abrasives can also contain crystalline silica, so materials such as grinding wheels, although that's not very common, but more importantly, abrasives that are used for blasting surfaces can contain crystalline silica. And lastly, paints and materials added to paint might be another source. Over on the right-hand side, where it talks about materials with low or non-crystalline containing don't contain crystalline silica, the one that I want to note that particularly applies to construction is the third box down, where it uses the word amorphous silica. There are many construction materials that contain these amorphous products. Amorphous silica does not have the crystalline structure that other forms of silica have, and the only things that actually create the diseases that we talked about before are the crystalline forms of silica. So if you see these terms on safety data sheets, such as silica gel or fumed silica or amorphous silica, these are materials that, while they may create a dust problem for you, they do not apply, they don't fall under the crystalline silica standards and present much less risk for your employees. So processes that create respirable crystalline silica are the ones that we're most concerned about. And I've listed a few tasks here where you can find processes or activities that can generate airborne dust. Handling, mixing, and moving of dry materials that contain crystalline silica can create airborne dust exposures. So things like slitting and dumping bags of materials, moving soil, and other materials like that can create airborne dust. Abrasive blasting creates very large amounts of airborne dust, and if the abrasive material contains crystalline silica, or if the substrate that's being blasted contains crystalline silica, you can release very large amounts of airborne dust. Use of tools and equipment on materials that contain crystalline silica is probably the most common exposure scenario for construction sites. So use of things like rotary hammers, surface grinders, and things like that can create very high dust exposures for employees that use those tools or equipment. Housekeeping tasks can also generate dust. So after work is done and someone is dry sweeping, that can create a very large amount of respirable dust, and if that dust contains crystalline silica, can be a significant source of exposure for workers. And lastly, doing maintenance work on equipment, handling materials that have crystalline silica can be a source. This probably isn't very common, but if the equipment that you are using, such as a concrete mixer, has to be cleaned, and one of the common cleaning methods is chipping that material out, that can create airborne crystalline silica dust. So I've listed a number of construction tasks that tend to generate respirable crystalline silica dust. We've already mentioned abrasive blasting. And if you look at the data that's been collected over time, tuck point is probably one of the largest exposures to respirable crystalline silica dust. And I've listed the next two that are listed on the slide. Surface grinding and cutting and sawing and polishing the materials listed are also very high potential crystalline silica dust generating tasks. Drilling and coring activities, when it's done on concrete, can also create a large amount of dust, as does jackhammering or chipping. Milling refers to the use of equipment to grind up roads or grind up concrete, and obviously that can create dust for the workers that are doing those tasks. Drywalling, the primary source of exposure there is the joint compounds, and even if they are low crystalline silica containing compounds, it doesn't mean there's no hazard there, because you can still create large amounts of dust which would fall under other OSHA standards. In painting operations, sometimes sand is added to paints, and as it's applied, or particularly as it's mixed or ground or use of sandpaper to smooth surfaces, you can get crystalline silica release there. Materials over the jobs over on the other side tend to be, except with the exception of sweeping and cleaning up, tend to be a little bit lower exposures, or they're usually tasks of short duration. And most construction site, when people are using dry materials, they're not necessarily using those all day. A bag may be slit and dumped, and then nothing's done for the rest of the day. So the exposures may be short and may not result in time-weighted averages that are very high. Building demolition can obviously create large amounts of dust exposure for people that are using equipment. However, if you use cabs and enclosed cabs with filtration, the exposure to the people doing those tasks tend to be low. Hand it back to Patrick.
All right, thanks, Kay. Now, before we dig into the guts of the standard, I would like you to consider how non-compliance with the provisions of the standard could potentially impact your business. Those three non-compliance concerns: your ability to bid on projects, your ability to obtain insurance coverage, and the possibility of OSHA penalties or fines. I'm sure all of us remember the large dust cloud which covered Manhattan after the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings on 9/11. What you might not recall is that this dust cloud was full of pollutants, which included respirable crystalline silica. Many of the first responders have died or become disabled since that day from respiratory diseases, and others from lung cancer. And the same cycle continues today with employees who are exposed to silica on a daily basis in a variety of mainstream industries. In fact, at work, about 2.3 million people are exposed to respirable crystalline silica, and according to OSHA, this standard will prevent 600 deaths per year and prevent another 900 new cases of silicosis per year. Now, insurance agents might be asking, how will this standard affect prospect accounts and renewals? Underwriters might be asking, how will this affect underwriting standards, and what is a quote-unquote good account? Workers' compensation claims representatives might be asking, will this standard cause more occupational disease claims to be filed? And finally, contractors might be asking, what will be required of us and of subcontractors on job sites? All great questions that we hope to answer as we move through the remainder of the slides. As we look at the impact from an insurance company standpoint, as you can probably guess, the cost to cover illnesses related to silica have the potential to be very expensive. Some insurance companies are considering, and some may have already made decisions, to attach endorsements excluding silica exposure to liability policies. This may be necessary because it is not only the employee illnesses that are a cause for concern, but also third-party claims due to the activities of some industries like mining, construction, and agricultural. Underwriters and insurance agents will need to take a closer look at accounts that have an exposure to silica. They know that non-compliance with the OSHA standard increases the chance of an occupational illness, which might result in a workers' compensation claim or a general liability claim. For contractors with this exposure, failure to comply with the standard could result in increased insurance premiums. It could also result in some insurance companies not wanting to insure your business at all. Now, the intent of the standard is to reduce the number of cases of silicosis, lung cancer, kidney disease, and other respiratory diseases. In a nutshell, help workers to lead more productive, healthy, and happy lives. With that said, as I mentioned earlier, OSHA began enforcing most provisions of the standard for construction as of September 23, 2017. Now, for the first 30 days, OSHA offered compliance assistance instead of enforcement for those employers who were making a good faith effort to comply. However, as of October 23, 2017, OSHA began to fully enforce all appropriate provisions of the Silica and Construction Standard. This means that employers that are found to be in violation of any provisions of the standard will be issued a citation or citations depending on the circumstances. And these citations can range in cost based on the type of violation. They, and when I say they, I mean OSHA, issues a serious violation when an employer knows or should have known of a situation that has a definite chance of causing serious injury or death, but does not correct it. A violation of OSHA rules that would not usually cause death or serious injury, but that is nevertheless related to job safety or employee health, is considered an other than serious violation. The most serious violation category is willful. You are in this for intentional violations of OSHA rules or for situations that show a complete disregard for employee health and safety. Now, you can also receive citations for failure to abate, which means you were given a date to make corrections and failed to do so by the abatement date. And finally, you could receive a violation for a repeat offense if you're found to be in violation of a standard you were previously cited for during a prior inspection. These violations can range in penalties up to $12,934 for a serious or other than serious violation, $12,934 per day beyond the abatement date for failure to abate, and up to $129,336 for a willful or repeat violation. Based on these numbers alone, it would be more cost effective to comply than to risk paying the potential fines. With that, I am going to turn this back over to Kay.
So we'll talk a little bit more about the standards here, and it's important to note that there are actually two different respirable crystalline silica standards. One of them applies, as mentioned before, to general industry and the other to construction. There are some of you who may actually have dual exposures to both of these standards. For example, if you are a countertop manufacturer and you're fabricating countertops in a shop, that would fall under general industry. However, if you are then going out on a construction site and installing those countertops, that would fall under the construction standard. So if you fall into those categories, it's important to become familiar with both of those standards. As I mentioned before, the standards only apply to respirable crystalline silica, and this is a very important thing to note, that the standards only apply if the action level, which we recall is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, is exceeded under any foreseeable condition. So it's really important that while the goal may be to get below the PEL, the ultimate goal should be to get below the action level so the standards don't even apply to you. So as I mentioned before, the permissible exposure limit was established and an action level was established. The standard also requires employee exposure assessments in the case of construction, or for those covered activities, adherence to Table 1. And we're going to spend a lot of time on Table 1 in a few minutes so that you can become familiar with what tasks are covered and how to comply with those requirements. The standard also requires additional actions depending on exposures. For example, if you have exposures that are over the PEL for a non-covered Table 1 task, you will be required to do quarterly air sampling to assess those exposures until they can be better controlled. The standard also prohibits certain types of housekeeping methods that require dust, and this is probably going to be one of the more difficult portions of the standard for contractors and others to comply with. The standard also requires communications of hazards to the employees that are covered under the standard. There are also record-keeping requirements, and as Patrick mentioned, compliance deadlines that must be followed. So let's talk about some similarities in these two standards, especially for those of you who might be covered by both standards. As mentioned before, the standard's already in effect for construction, but for general industry, the deadline for compliance is coming up rapidly on June 23rd of this year. The construction has these 18 Table 1 tasks that if you follow them, you do not have to do exposure assessments, which is a big advantage of following Table 1. However, in general industry, there is no Table 1, so the requirement there is that you have to do some type of an employee exposure assessment, and that generally means air sampling. Both standards have medical surveillance requirements. However, in construction, it only applies to employees who have to wear a respirator for more than 30 days per year. So if you are in that category, you'll have to figure out a method for how you're going to keep track of who's wearing a respirator for more than 30 days per year. In general industry, it's triggered by whether or not the job is over the PEL or over the action limit for more than 30 days a year. So it has nothing to do with the use of a respirator. It's all triggered by the exposure limits. In construction, you have to designate a competent person who is able to recognize silica hazards and make sure that people are protected. In general industry, there is no such requirement. In construction, you don't have to establish a regulated area, although restricted areas are required to be established if the exposure is thought to be over the PEL. In general industry, though, any area that's over the PEL has to be designated as a regulated area. And lastly, there's a difference in the employee notification. If you do air sampling to assess employee exposures, you have 5 days following the receipt of the results to tell employees what those results were. In general industry, it's 15 days. So what's the same? Well, the exposure limit and action level is the same. The same sampling methods are used to assess the exposure. The requirements to implement feasible engineering control or work practice controls if the exposure exceeds the PEL applies. Although again, if you adhere to Table 1, you are not required to worry about the PEL, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes more. Respirators have to be provided for general industry when exposures exceed the PEL, and in construction you have to provide respirators if the Table 1 requires that they be used or if the PEL is exceeded. The prohibitions on the use of compressed air and dry sweeping and dry brushing for cleaning apply in both standards. Written exposure control plans must be prepared, and what's required in a medical surveillance program is the same for both standards, even though who it applies to is different. The hazard communication requirements are exactly the same as are the record-keeping requirements. So let's talk just a little bit about medical surveillance programs. As mentioned, it only applies to people in construction if you wear a respirator for more than 30 days per year. It's important to note that these are not the same as exams that apply to fitness to wear a respirator or commonly called medical evaluations for respirator use. So just because you send someone in for that evaluation doesn't mean that you're complying with the crystalline silica aspects of the medical surveillance program. These are very detailed examinations that must be provided to employees, and they must be applied within 30 days after hire. They must be offered at no cost and at a convenient time and place to an employee. And this can become a real challenge in a construction environment where people may not be close to medical providers or may be moving around frequently. The hazard communication requirements, as I mentioned, for both standards are exactly the same. If you're already complying with the existing hazard communication standard, you're most of the way there in what you have to do. But there is some additional requirements that are listed in this Silica standard, and these are outlined in the bullet points below. The key is that employees have, if they're over the action level, they have to be able to demonstrate knowledge and that they understand the topics that are listed there. And you can see that they're pretty specific requirements. So it's important that if you have exposures over the action level, that you make sure that these elements are included in your hazard communication program. As with all provisions of HazCom, you have to provide the training at initial assignment and as necessary thereafter. And it must be done in a manner and language the employee can understand. So if you have non-English speaking employees, you still have to provide that training to them in a way that they, excuse me, in a way that they can understand the requirements. Excuse me. OSHA expects that employees will have an opportunity to ask questions and get answers on any training provided. And what they're talking about here is they don't want you to just sit someone in front of a video and call that training. They actually expect that there be some interaction between the person providing the training and the employee. The last provision of the hazard communication requirements of the Silica standard is that you have to make a copy of the standard available to employees. So this may mean you'll have to get a copy of the standard and have it available, say, in a contractor's trailer or something like that. So there's two paths to compliance under the construction standard, and this is a very important designation to understand because it's going to determine what you're going to have to do after you've looked at whether or not you have silica exposures. So on the left-hand slide are the specific control methods, commonly called Table 1. There are 18 tasks that are listed there, and it's very important to understand that the table applies to this work only if you fully and properly implement the controls that are specified. You don't have to do exposure assessments if you fully and properly implement Table 1. But you still have to comply with the rest of the standards. So really what Table 1 gets you out of is the requirement to do ongoing air monitoring or even to do air monitoring in the first place. So it's important, though, to remember that this does not get you out of complying with the medical surveillance or hazard communication or the need for the written exposure control plan that are detailed in the rest of the standard. The second option for construction employers is to use the alternative exposure control method. So what does this mean? Well, it means you have two options here. One is that you gather your own employee exposure data through air monitoring, or you use objective data that is, say, industry-wide data or data that might be supplied by tool manufacturers. Many of the tool manufacturers and equipment manufacturers have published objective data that can demonstrate whether or not a control can get you under the PEL or action level. And that data can be used as long as it applies to your workplace in a similar manner. The alternative exposure control method requires that you limit exposures to the PEL, and if you're over it, you have to use feasible controls to limit those exposures and supplement with the respirator as necessary. Obviously, you have to keep records of the assessments and, again, still comply with the entire rest of the standard. This table is just kind of a summary of what I've just mentioned. It comes out of a document called the Small Entity Guide for Construction for the Respirable Crystalline Silica thing. If you have not read that document, it's a fabulous resource for you. And this just summarizes what you have to do if you're fully and properly implementing Table 1 versus following the alternative exposure controls. Many employers want to be in the Table 1 category, but there are tasks that simply are not covered by Table 1, and we'll talk about what to do in those circumstances. So what are the 18 Table 1 tasks? Well, they're listed here, and if you're in the construction industry, you may find going, wow, some of the things we do are not listed here. Some common things that are not listed on Table 1 are manual slitting and dumping of bags of material that contain crystalline silica. Also, if you're a drywall contractor and you are using joint compounds, that is not a Table 1 listed task either. So there's a number of things that don't really fall under Table 1, but it does hit the heavy hitters, and that was kind of the rationale OSHA had in putting together this table. They tried to go after the tasks that created the highest exposures for employees and had demonstrated control technology that people could use. So the first thing to do is, as you're looking at your work, is to go down this list and say, are we doing these things in our construction site? And if so, you can go to the next step, which is figuring out how do we apply the Table 1 to our work environment. So in order to use Table 1, you have to use the specific required control method exactly as indicated in the table. OSHA has also produced a number of fact sheets for each of these 18 tasks that provide more details on what their expectations are for employers to follow to be considered a Table 1 task. You'll notice that in each of the Table 1 tasks, there's going to be a length of exposure. There's going to be an indication of whether or not Table 1 applies to indoor, enclosed, or outdoor work. I'll say that enclosed work means work that's kind of an in-between an indoor and an outdoor area. It may be actually located outdoors, however, because of the maybe walls present, it may be considered an enclosed space, even though it is kind of more outdoors than indoors. Any deviations from the specifications OSHA has means you have to use the alternative exposure control method. So it's very important that if you have a Table 1 task, that you look carefully to see, are you following those requirements specifically. So let's take one of these Table 1 tasks and dissect it a little bit, and they all pretty much look the same. They will list on the left-hand side of the table the type of tool or task that it applies to. So in our example here, we have handheld power saws of any blade diameter. So you can think about concrete cutting saws as an example of a handheld power saw. In the second column will be the specified engineering and work practice control methods. In this particular case, saws have to be equipped with an integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. And the key point here is that it has to be an integrated system. And the way that OSHA looks at this is it has to be part of the tool as designed. It can't necessarily be something that you're adding onto after the fact. So then there's more information provided in the table as to what they expect. There are two different usages that they're considering, outdoor use and then indoor and use in enclosed area. They also make the assumption that you are familiar with what the manufacturer's instructions are to use the tool properly and follow those to a T. So if you deviate from what the manufacturer says, let's say, for example, you don't like how fast that water is being delivered to the blade and you want to tone it down somewhat, that would be violating the manufacturer's instructions, so now you're kicked out of Table 1. So you really need to read those manuals and understand what the manufacturer is requiring for their control measure. Over on the right-hand side are the required respiratory protection for these tasks. And all of the tables are pretty much set up the same way. They're divided into less than 4 hours of the task per shift and then greater than 4 hours per shift. So if we look at, for example, using this tool with an integrated water system outdoors for less than 4 hours a shift, you don't have to do anything. You're in compliance as long as that engineering control is working properly. If you, however, move that work to indoors, even if you use it with the water system, now you have to provide respiratory protection no matter how long that person uses that tool. The respirator that's required has to have an APF of 10. An APF is an assigned protection factor that rates how good a respirator is. And a common respirator with an APF of 10 would be a filtering facepiece respirator or a half-mask respirator with filters on it. So all the tables basically have the same layout. And in this table, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to hit upon a few points because the language that is used in each of these 18 tasks follows a similar pattern. They define what an integrated water system is. They define what full and proper implementation means, so they're giving you more details on what their expectations are, and then there's information provided on the respiratory protection. So for each of these tasks, you need to read these things, and I would really recommend reading the small entity guide as well as the fact sheet for the task to just get a little more insight into what OSHA is looking for here. So exposure assessments. Let's say that you can't comply with Table 1, that your particular tool isn't listed or your task isn't listed. Now you're going to be thrown into having to do exposure assessments. These assessments, you have to pick out representative employees and representative tasks, and then assess the time-weighted average breathing zone exposure for the employee. The samples have to be collected outside the respirator, so if you do have a respirator on an employee, say you have a hooded PAPR respirator, that device doesn't go under the hood, it must be outside of the hood. And you have to collect the samples using a respirable dust sampler that's operated correctly. The standard does specify what methods have to be used, and there's nothing new here. This is what we've used for a very long time to assess silica exposures. Now, there is this provision in the standard that you can rely on objective data that's generated perhaps by tool manufacturers or industry. For example, in the asphalt industry, they've generated a tremendous amount of objective data that can be used as long as what you're doing is very similar to what that objective data is. And this may be enough to say that you're either under the action level or perhaps under the PEL. And again, as we mentioned before, you have to, once you do air monitoring, you must notify the results, and that notification must be in writing. If you do exposure assessments and you have to implement controls because you're over the PEL, OSHA requires you to follow their hierarchy of controls. And from OSHA's perspective, engineering, work practice controls, or elimination of the hazard is what they're actually looking for. Sometimes controls can't achieve complete compliance, but they still require you to get the levels down to the lowest feasible level and supplement with respiratory protection. And it's very important to know that respirators are not considered controls. They are a protective measure, but they're not a control, except if you have a Table 1 task where you're following the Table 1 specifications for respirator use. It's very important that if you're trying to do feasible controls, to document what you've done, what worked and didn't work, so that in the event your friendly compliance officer shows up, you can at least show good faith that you're doing something and show that we tried feasible controls and we still couldn't control the exposures well enough. And so that documentation step is really very important. Another aspect of the construction standard is to designate a competent person. A competent person is someone who can perform the following 3 tasks. There's someone who can identify where the respirable crystalline silica hazards are. They have the authorization to take correct measures to eliminate or minimize the exposures, or if that can't be done, to stop the work. They also must be able to conduct frequent and regular inspections of the work site and to implement the written exposure control plan. So this is someone who has to have a lot of authority and a lot of familiarity with where silica comes from and how to ensure the work site is safe and that people are following the written exposure control plans. You may have different people for different sites depending on how you want to structure it. OSHA doesn't care how you structure it, just that there is a competent person. The competent person should be able to stop work under certain circumstances. If you have a control that's not working properly, you need to shut the work down and fix it and then resume work after that. If you introduce a new process or task that requires an exposure assessment, the competent person should make sure that that happens. When respiratory protection is provided, the competent person should ensure that employees are wearing their protection properly, and if not, then they need to be able to stop the work. This is probably one of the most important things in a construction environment, that when there are contractors that are not necessarily your employees that are making work that generates crystalline silica in your area, you need to be able to remove those people from that area, your people from that area, until that exposure can be controlled or until that work is done. So written exposure control plans is another requirement of the standard. And there's 4 elements to a written exposure control plan. There's specific descriptions of where the exposure occurs, what controls you're using, how you're limiting access to areas where there are high exposures, and a description of what housekeeping measures you're going to use to reduce dust exposures. I've seen various types of these plans, and some of them are very complicated and some are simple. I like the simple ones because I think that's what people can understand and follow a lot easier. There are some websites available. silicasafe.org has a little tool that you can go online and actually generate a written exposure control plan. It doesn't cover all tasks, but at least it gives you a starting point to prepare one of these. These should be annually reviewed and updated as necessary, and these have to be made available to the employees, their representatives, and to OSHA if OSHA asks for that. Housekeeping, as I mentioned before, there's a prohibition on dry sweeping, dry brushing, or compressed air for cleaning surfaces or clothing. The permitted methods that OSHA wants to see are wet sweeping methods, HEPA vacuuming. They've also indicated that using sweeping compound is another acceptable way of doing a housekeeping task. Believe it or not, these exposures can generate very high levels of respirable crystalline silica, so it's important that you follow the good housekeeping provisions.
All right, thanks very much, Kay. As we wrap this up, there's no doubt that respirable crystalline silica can be found at some level on all construction sites. It is up to the employer to determine what tasks have the potential to expose employees, as well as others, to silica, and then take the necessary measures to protect them from overexposure. What controls you must implement will depend on the tasks, the amount of exposure, and the length of time exposed. The good faith grace period that OSHA was providing is over, and you must be in compliance with the standards for silica. You can either use a control method laid out in Table 1 of the construction standard, or you can measure workers' exposure to silica and then decide which dust controls work best to limit it in your workplaces. However, keep this in mind. Making the decision to do nothing or to hope for the best may not only result in significant OSHA fines, but could also limit your ability to bid on projects or obtain insurance coverage. For those of you that would like additional information on this topic, here are a few links to resources. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health has links to other resources, including books, university resources, and various government resources. Also, OSHA's website includes a variety of resources, including a small enterprise compliance guide for silica compliance, as well as fact sheets, frequently asked questions, and silica rule updates. And for our society insurance policyholders, you have access to our free streaming videos, which, as luck would have it, includes a video on crystalline silica safety training. All right, we'd like to take this time to answer your questions. Again, you can type them into the webinar control panel on the right where you see chat and hit return. Feel free to send them to us now if you haven't already, and we'll do our best to answer them for everyone. And it looks like we already have a couple, so I'm just going to read those off quick. The first question is, will we be sent these slides to reference? And the answer is yes. We will actually be uploading this to our website probably sometime today or within the next day or so. They will also eventually be loaded to our YouTube channel, and you can find the webinar there, so you can reference them in the future. The other question is related to medical surveillance, and is it required if respirator worn more than 30 days? So it doesn't matter how long it is worn each day, 1 hour a day versus 8 hours a day. And I'm going to actually let Kay take that one.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how long a person is wearing it during an 8-hour shift. If it's worn on a day that counts any time for any length of period on a day, that would count as one of the 30 days. Here's another one.
All right, we just got another question in. Can you elaborate on broom sweeping? And again, I'm going to hand that off to Kay.
Yeah, broom sweeping, particularly in enclosed spaces or indoor spaces, when the material has crystalline silica, and most often we're talking about situations where there is settled concrete dust and the work is being done and now you're doing your final cleanup, it can generate enormous amounts of respirable crystalline silica. I've done some sampling for that task, and even a couple hours of dry sweeping in a place that's not well ventilated will put you up well over the PEL. And for this reason, OSHA prohibits the use of broom or dry sweeping to clean things. And this is going to be a huge challenge for people. I think the fact that they have not ruled out using dry sweeping compound, that is one way of trying to reduce the dust, and it's very effective at reducing dust, and it's kind of a low-tech way to do that. If for other situations you're going to be stuck with either primarily using some type of a vacuum cleaner that is adequate for removing dust. These are very difficult provisions, but I don't see a way of getting around them. The OSHA does say that if it's not feasible, that you can use these methods. However, I think they're going to be very fussy about what they consider feasible when HEPA vacuums and these other technologies are available. Water would be another method of being able to clean a surface if it's something that could be done, say, in an outdoor environment where you don't have to worry about the water necessarily. That would be another acceptable cleaning method.
All right.
Another one?
Thanks, Kate. Actually, we've got another one in here. Let's see. Outdoor sweeping, sand has to be dry as jointing compound?
Not sure what that means. Oh, that you can't wet. Yeah, and I think we recognize that some of these materials can't be wetted. And so wet cleaning methods couldn't be used. In that case, you pretty much are going to be either using a sweeping compound or you're going to have to use a HEPA vacuuming for cleaning that material up. There really are no other choices.
Okay, very good. Kate, any other questions before we look to wrap it up? Oh, you're very much welcome.
You know, one of the questions that I get asked about the Table 1 task is what happens if we are not exactly following Table 1? So let's say, for example, you're using a tool and it's one of the requirements is that it has a manufacturer's integrated water control system. Let's say I've got great maintenance people, I can design my own thing. How does that fall under the Table 1? And the answer to that is, well, it doesn't follow under Table 1 at all, so you really can't use that. But what you could do is you could make your design and then have air samples taken to demonstrate that it is an effective control measure. And that way you've developed your own data to show that if we use our homemade water suppression system by buying a tank at Farm and Fleet and rigging up a hose with a ball valve control, that effectively reduces exposure, that's okay. But you are going to have to collect air sampling data to demonstrate that that's the case.
All right, very good. I got a couple questions here that I will answer once the webinar is completed. I have email addresses, so I will get back to you at some point. With that, on behalf of Kay and myself, we would like to thank you for joining us today. We truly hope this information has been helpful and that you now have a better understanding of the new requirements of OSHA's Silica standard. Everyone should be receiving a follow-up survey in your email shortly, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We do read them, and it is a big help to us with the development of future webinars. And speaking of future webinars, we will have more free webinars throughout 2018. Watch your email, our website, and social media for topics, dates, and times. For those of you that would like to learn more about how Society Insurance can help protect your business, visit our website, www.societyinsurance.com. Thanks again, everyone, and have a safe and enjoyable rest of your day.